Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 772 for June 16th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
So all in all, it just seemed like a really wonderful opportunity to take Rabbit Hole beyond the bounds of our region, beyond the bounds of U.S., and really achieve my vision and my hope of getting Rabbit Hole to be an international brand and a household brand in my lifetime.
Kaveh Zamanian opened the Rabbit Hole Distillery in Louisville just over a year ago. Friday, he took on a new partner. Pernod Ricard bought a majority stake in Rabbit Hole from Zamanian and his investors. It's a deal modeled on the company's 2016 acquisition of Smooth Ambler Distillery in West Virginia. He and his family still own most of their remaining shares in Rabbit Hole, and he'll stay on to run the distillery with support from Pernod Ricard, which is back in the Kentucky whiskey business for the first time in a decade. We'll have the complete story later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and a whole lot more. All on this edition of WhiskyCast.
Make this Father's Day unforgettable with a personalized bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. Go to reservebar.com and use code GIFTDAD for exclusive pricing on an engraved bottle. Because if anyone deserves Blue Label, it's Dad. Please drink responsibly. Johnnie Walker Blue Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo, Norwalk, Connecticut.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. The legal debate over shipping whiskeys, wines, and other alcoholic beverages across U.S. state lines could be resolved in the next few days. That's because the Supreme Court is expected to issue its ruling in a Tennessee case either this Monday or next Monday, which is the final day of this year's term. The court is considering whether a Tennessee law that only allows state residents to get a liquor store license violates the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause. That's the part of the Constitution that bans states from discriminating against businesses that are based in other states. The wider implication could be for state liquor laws in general, including those that ban out-of-state retailers from shipping wine and spirits to their states. The last time the Supreme Court heard a case like this was back in 2005 and ruled then that states could not allow local wineries to ship directly to consumers while banning shipments from out-of-state wineries. On the regulatory front, the range of potential finishing casks for Scotch whiskies has been opened up. The Scotch Whisky Association and the British government have tweaked the technical file that sets the specifications for Scotch whisky at both the UK and the European Union level. The change clears the way for whiskey makers to use casks that previously held tequila or other spirits, as well as beer or ale and wines, as long as they're not made from stone fruits, such as peaches, or had any fruit, flavoring, or sweetening added after fermentation or distillation. That still rules out the use of cider casks. In other news, the whiskey tourism scene is getting more and more crowded. This week, Lag Distillery on Scotland's Isle of Arran officially opened its visitors center to tourists, and Woodford Reserve Distillery in Kentucky cut the ribbon on the expansion of its visitors center as well. This coming week is a busy one for Diageo. It'll open the new Bullet Distillery Visitors Center in Shelbyville, Kentucky, and tours begin this coming Friday at the new Roe & Co. Distillery in Dublin, Ireland, in what was formerly the old power station for the Guinness St. James's Gate Brewery. Meanwhile, Buffalo Trace Distillery announced this week that it will be expanding its visitors center yet again over the coming year. More than 231,000 people visited the distillery last year. That expansion is part of Sazerac's overall $1.2 billion long-term expansion plan for Buffalo Trace. It includes a $50 million bottling hall to be completed in August. The distillery is also installing new grain cookers and fermenters this summer, along with a new cooling tower, and will build 2 new rickhouses this year. Beam Suntory has confirmed a report that should make Knob Creek bourbon fans happy. A couple of years ago, Beam Suntory removed the 9-year-old age statement from Knob Creek, but bourbon blogger and writer Chuck Cowdery reported this week that the age statement is coming back. And as I noted, Beam Suntory has confirmed that report. There will also be another change for the Beam Small Batch collection. Baker's Bourbon is not going away, but it will become a 7-year-old single-barrel bourbon. As Chuck first reported, Baker Beam is working with Fred Noe and his son Freddie on the change. No word yet on when the first bottling of the Baker's single barrel will be released, but you can listen to my 2013 interview with Baker Beam in episode 446 of WhiskyCast. You'll find it in the archives at whiskycast.com. Kentucky Peerless Distillery in Louisville has been winning awards for its 2- and 3-year-old rye whiskeys over the last several years since Corky Taylor revived the family business. But the original Peerless reputation was built on bourbon. And this coming Saturday, Peerless will debut its first bourbon in 102 years.
My great-grandfather, Henry Craver, shut the distillery down in 1917 because of World War I purposes. He sold his stills to United Distillery in Vancouver, British Columbia, but he had 63,000 barrels of bourbon he had to get rid of because he was making so much bourbon in that era. He was one of the largest distilleries in the state of Kentucky during that period. And so during Prohibition, he had to get licenses to distribute alcohol. Most of his alcohol went to Chicago. At one time, he owned the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago. And what I found out later on, I only found out about a year ago, he was good friends with the Walgreen brothers up there of Walgreen Pharmacy, and he was able to sell just a little under 40,000 barrels of that bourbon to the Walgreen brothers for medicinal purposes.
The new Peerless Bourbon is 4 years old and bottled at 53.5% ABV. It will go on sale at the distillery starting at 10 a.m. this coming Saturday. And there's a reason for picking June 22nd.
I'm the 4th generation. My son Carson, that's in there, is the 5th. We skipped the 3rd generation. That was my father. He was always in the military, so we skipped him. But in honor of my father, I'm bringing it out on his birthday. June 22nd, next Saturday, is his birthday, so we're honoring him, and that'll be our first bottle of bourbon sold in 102 years.
By the way, Corky Taylor plans to release a 4-year-old Peerless Rye in October, and he has plans to raise the age of the bourbon from 4 years to 5 or 6 as their current inventories mature. Old Forester won't release its annual birthday bourbon until George Garvin Brown's birthday, September 2nd, but we got the details on this year's edition this week. The 2019 birthday bourbon is an 11-year-old whiskey distilled on May 15th, 2008. It's being bottled at 52.5% ABV, making it the strongest of the 19 annual releases so far. About 13,000 bottles will go on sale around Labor Day with a recommended retail price of $99.99 each. We'll have tasting notes for it before then at whiskycast.com. On the Scotch whiskey front, here's a story that you'll only hear on WhiskyCast. Back in the day, Scotland's River Clyde was a major center for shipbuilding west of Glasgow, and the term Clydebuilt became synonymous with the region. The Ardgowan Distillery Company will be releasing its first whiskeys under the Clydebuilt brand starting this fall. Veteran whiskey maker Max McFarlane lives just down the road from where the new distillery will be built, and he's already working on the first release, the Coppersmith Blended Malt.
I've always had a great soft spot
for first fill sherry casks. Obviously, I see a lot of them in my days at Edrington, because of the Macallan Highland Park side of things. So we're doing a blended malt, Coppersmith, and I'm hoping that it will be 100% first fill sherries, which I think in itself is fairly unique in the industry. And I've been fortunate because of my history in Edrington. Edrington have been very kind to and offered us a fair amount of first fill sherries and also some refills which we may use later on in the project.
2,500 bottles of Coppersmith will go on sale this fall in the UK and Asia. We'll have more with Max McFarlane and Ardgowan CEO Martin McAdam next time around. And Douglas Lang & Company is expanding its extra old particular range with the Black Series. This series will focus on what's being described as the, quote, most special single casks in the family's inventory. The first bottling is a 1994 cask of Springbank that's 24 years old and was matured in a sherry hogshead cask. Only 148 bottles will be available. There's no word on pricing. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan, it's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today, it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Whiskey Lounge has Fagile tastings this Wednesday night in Leeds, England, and Thursday night in Manchester, England. Tickets are still available for the Bourbon and Band-Aids charity fundraiser Thursday night at the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, Kentucky. Balcones Distillery has its High Plains Single Malt Release Party at the distillery in Waco, Texas on Saturday the 22nd. Rocktown Distillery in Little Rock, Arkansas has its 9th anniversary party that same day, too. Uskeba in Edinburgh, Scotland has a Tobermory tasting with master distiller Stephen Woodcock on the 24th. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society has a July Outturn preview tasting on the 27th at Boyd's Jig and Reel Pub in Knoxville, Tennessee. Sweden's High Coast Distillery has its annual whiskey festival in Höga Kusten, Sweden on June 28th and 29th. While the Arran Malt and Music Festival is June 28th through the 30th in Lacranza, Scotland, and Whiskey Freedom 2019 is on June 29th in Perth, Australia. Right now, we have 189 different events on our searchable calendar at WhiskyCast.com. Just click on the search button to find events near you or wherever you'll be traveling soon.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. 10 years ago, Pernod Ricard got out of the bourbon business when it sold Wild Turkey to Gruppo Campari for $575 million. At the time, the company needed the cash to help pay for its acquisition of Absolute Vodka, but it left Pernod Ricard on the sidelines just as the bourbon boom was beginning. In late 2016, Pernod Ricard dipped its toe back into American whiskey when it acquired a majority stake in West Virginia-based Smooth Ambler Spirits, while leaving founder John Little in place to run things on a day-to-day basis. Now, Pernod Ricard is returning to Kentucky, doing a similar deal with Louisville's Rabbit Hole Distilling. As with the Smooth Ambler deal, Rabbit Hole will become part of the New Brand Ventures unit within Pernod Ricard USA, while founder Kaveh Zamanian will remain in charge of Rabbit Hole and retain a significant ownership stake. Jeff Agdern heads up the New Brand Ventures unit.
Look, Pernod Ricard USA is underrepresented in the American whiskey and the bourbon category. And what Kaveh and his team have done with Rabbit Hole in the last couple of years in terms of establishing a showpiece distillery in downtown Louisville and creating a great reputation as a new craft whiskey producer really attracted us to the business. And after meeting Kaveh and the team, we really wanted to partner with them and help them to achieve the ambition that they wanted to achieve.
Obviously, you want to try to improve their distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the Rabbit Hole still has supply coming online more and more over the next 18 months. And our role in the partnership is to make sure that those products are distributed in the right accounts where the right consumer is going to be shopping. And today the brand's only available in 18 markets. But by the end of 2020, we'll make it available in all 50 markets, and we want to make sure that it's done and built the right way.
So are you still looking for more acquisitions, or is this going to be it for a little while you absorb this one?
I mean, look, there's always a certain amount of energy that it takes to absorb, a new partnership, but Pernod Ricard is always evaluating brands in the market that are interesting, that fill a need in our portfolio. And so this partnership doesn't preclude us from doing any other deals in the near term. It's just a matter of making sure it's the right opportunity with the right team that we want to partner with.
Kaveh Zamanian was not in Louisville when the deal was announced Friday. The night before, he was being honored by Ernst & Young at its regional Entrepreneurs of the Year banquet in Cincinnati, with plans to fly straight from there to be one of CEO Alexander Ricard's guests of honor at Pernod Ricard's annual summer party in Paris. But before he got on the plane, we spent a few minutes discussing the deal.
It was a tough decision because from the very beginning I didn't necessarily set out to get into a partnership. But I think that after 2 years of having a lot of suitors come to the table and say no pretty much to all of them, Alex really presented in a way that very candidly just was unexpected. He approached Rabbit Hole, he approached me and my team in a very respectful way, and after a lot of conversation, a lot of discussions, it was clear that we are fully aligned when it comes to our culture, particularly, for me, the entrepreneurship element of it is really important. I got into business because I wanted to innovate. I got into business because I wanted to make sure that we're thinking out of the box and we're quick and nimble and we're not tied down by large companies, protracted kind of layers, if you would. But, this is one of those partnerships that allows us to do all that, but at the same time have the benefit of a large company's network, both from a sales and distribution point of view, but also from the standpoint of just expertise. I think one of the things that I'm excited about is also to be able to have access to a lot of resources that Pernod has on the production side of it and other aspects of the business. So all in all, it just seemed like a really wonderful opportunity to take Rabbit Hole beyond the bounds of our region, beyond the bounds of U.S., and really achieve my vision and my hope of getting Rabbit Hole to be an international brand and a household brand in my lifetime. That's what it really came down to, Mike, where the challenges of being able to take a brand to market, and this type of partnership allows us to make Rabbit Hole what I think it deserves to be in a timeline that I'm able to see and be a part of.
I remember having a discussion with John Little at Smooth Ambler a couple of years ago when he did a deal very similar to yours. And one of the things that he talked about was being able to offload some of the backroom stuff, the accounting, the finance, the HR, and things like that, and let the pros at Pernod Ricard handle that, and it freed him up to get back to making whiskey. Do you see that in this case too?
Well, for us, it's a little bit different because we already have a very lean and robust team when it comes to finance, when it comes to HR and those things. I think some of those things are likely to be adjusted a little bit, but I would say in our case, relatively small adjustments. I think for us, the big thing is that access to expertise and some of the other components of it. Probably the biggest part of it is sales and distribution. Really, that's one of the biggest challenges, as you know, with all these consolidations going around, the most recent one being with Young's and RNDC. It really showcases how challenging it is to take a brand to market and be able to get the share of voice with some of the bigger houses. And that's one of the things that I'm excited about because from a standpoint of branding and marketing, production, finance, I think we've got an amazing team, and it's only going to get stronger with this partnership. The part that's going to be more of a kind of stress alleviator for us is going to be on that sales and distribution side of it, which for any brand of our size is a lot of work.
Now, you're going to retain the majority of your shares, so I'm assuming that essentially Pernod Ricard bought out your partners for the most part. Is that fair to say?
Correct. So I'm basically rolling back my equity along with two other family members that are currently and have been employed at the company for the last several years. So basically, it's three of us. I'm obviously the majority shareholder in that portion, but three family members are staying, and the rest of our investor group I'm so thankful for their support to help us get to where we are. Those folks are going to be exiting.
Had they envisioned this at some point, or had this been a long-term play for them as well?
I think for the most part, the majority of them saw this as an investment opportunity in a sector that they love because one of the things that's unique about Rabbit Hole is we were able to bring a lot of relatively small investors, local investors, majority of them, probably 95% of them from Kentucky. And these folks, have lived and breathed bourbon all their life and have been on the sidelines. And this was an opportunity for them to join a brand and see it get launched, get off the ground, and get to the point that it is. And we're certainly going to remember them in lots of different ways. And they're happy to exit and see us to get to this inflection point and have this opportunity to do it. So for the most part, everybody's very happy. And in short term, it's basically expected. It was expected that at some point somebody's going to, either myself or some other family members, we're going to basically get to a point where they would exit.
How long did it take to put this deal together? How long were you talking with Alex and Jeff Agdern and the folks at Pernod Ricard?
It's actually happened pretty fast. We started getting looks, if you would, 2 years ago, and we've had a lot of suitors come to the table, and I consistently have said no to all of them. Basically, Alex and my introduction to Alex was sometime in February. So in the last 4 or 5 months, I would say.
Where do you go from here?
Well, along the lines of what you were saying about Smooth Ambler, I think one of the things that I'm excited about is to really be able to spend more time and energy focusing on making whiskey and making sure that our quality is top of line and we're executing as efficiently as possible. And at the same time, be able to stay on top of it in terms of being able to innovate some new expressions. I'm really excited about a new SKU that we're adding this year. It's a high rye bourbon that's coming to the market, And we're working on various finishes. We're working on a cask strength release. So, these are some of the things that I love and I'm super passionate about. And with this partnership, I'm much more able to devote more time and attention to it.
Rabbit Hole's Distillery near downtown Louisville opened just a year ago, and the brand will still be relying on sourced whiskeys while its own barrels mature. Terms of the deal were not released. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Time now for the What I'm Tasting This Week department. I had the chance to do a head-to-head comparison between an original whiskey and its port cask finished version. In this case, the wheat whiskey from Dry Fly Distilling in Spokane, Washington. Now, I tasted the regular 3-year-old Dry Fly wheat whiskey years ago, but since then, the bottling strength has been raised from 40% to 45% ABV, and it does make a difference. The nose is warm and sweet with caramel syrup, dark chocolate, and subtle spices, while the taste starts off sweet and syrupy thick at first, with notes of dark chocolate, brown sugar, and caramel. There's a slow buildup of baking spices that rises to a good balance with the sweeter notes, as the combination sticks around for a nice long finish. Back in 2012 or so, I scored the Dry Fly wheat whiskey an 84. I've updated that now to an 88. While straight wheat whiskeys are relatively rare, a port-finished wheat whiskey is even rarer. Dry Fly's version takes that wheat whiskey and then gives it another 6 to 12 months in a port wine cask. It's still bottled at 45% ABV, but the port cask gives it even more sweetness with notes of raspberry jam, red grapes, muted spices, and a hint of vanilla. The taste is thick and sweet, just like the original, but the spicy touches of cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg come alive much sooner, while still balancing nicely against raspberry jam, dark chocolate, and a hint of oak. The finish is long and dry with subtle hints of oak and baking chocolate. I'm scoring the Dry Fly port-finished wheat whiskey a 90. And thanks to the folks at visitspokane.com for sending samples our way. I mentioned last month on the show that I had the chance to hang out with some of the members of the Irish Whiskey Society when I was in Dublin in mid-May, and they sent me home with a sample of the Society's 2016 bottling of a Middleton single pot still cask that marked the centenary of the Easter Rising in 1916. Now, this bottling was named the Irish Single Pot Still Whiskey of the Year in the 2016 Irish Whiskey Awards. It's bottled at 54.7% ABV, and the nose has subtle spices, along with honey, straw, dried flowers, butterscotch, and a hint of oak. The taste is viscous, oily, and spicy, with white pepper, clove, and a hint of cinnamon. And as the spices start to fade, hints of licorice, honey, apricots, butterscotch, and cocoa come alive. The finish is long and dry with touches of licorice, apricots, and cocoa. I can see why this one was so well acclaimed. I'm scoring the Irish Whiskey Society 2016 Marrowbone Lane Edition a 95. Finally, the other night I tweeted that I had just tasted a bourbon that had the intensity of some of the vintage George T. Stagg bourbons, but was not from Kentucky. I also tweeted that I wouldn't reveal it until this episode. Well, Distillery 291 in Colorado Springs, Colorado, put fewer than 50 bottles of its Aspen stave-finished straight bourbon on sale today for Father's Day. It's bottled at 65.3% ABV, and the nose has notes of pine needles, mint, dried fruits, and hints of black pepper, cinnamon, honey, and vanilla. Don't be fooled by that gentle aroma, though, because the taste grabs your palate and might even make you cry out for mama. It's that intense. I used to use the term thermonuclear spices back in the day to describe Stag, and this is one of the few whiskeys I've found in recent years that has that same level of intensity. You'll find the usual suspects: black pepper, cinnamon, chili powder, and maybe even some cayenne pepper in there, but there's also a nice complexity with hints of oak tannins, dried fruits, vanilla, and honey in the background, and a few drops of water barely cuts down the intensity. The finish is long and spicy, but still well-balanced. Any whiskey maker can make a spice bomb, but the hard part is to combine both intensity and complexity. And Distillery 291 did just that. I'm scoring their Aspen Stave finished bourbon a 94. I'm adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of tasting notes for more than 2,600 whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at WhiskyCast.com.
Make this Father's Day an unforgettable one. Mark the moment with a personalized bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label, a luxurious blend of some of the rarest and most exceptional whiskeys, sourced from Johnnie Walker's unparalleled reserves. Let Dad know how much he means to you with a personalized engraving on the bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. Go to reservebar.com and use code GIFTDAD for an exclusive pricing on an engraved bottle. Because if anyone deserves Blue Label, it's Dad. Please drink responsibly. Johnnie Walker Blue Label, blended Scotch whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume, imported by Diageo, Norwalk, Connecticut.
Heaven Hill whiskeys have been distilled with inspiration and aged with patience for more than 8 decades. Now it's time to share the stories behind those whiskeys and the people who make them. Download and listen to the new podcast, Tales from the Hill, from Heaven Hill Distillery. It's coming soon to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. More comments came in after our last episode with the story on a proposed change in U.S. regulations that could eliminate the standard 750 milliliter bottle size for whiskeys and other distilled spirits. That would potentially allow whiskey makers to legally sell the 700 ml bottles that are now sold in Europe and many other countries. Those bottles have been illegal in the U.S. since the switch to metric sizing back in 1980. Carlton Welch sent this email from Tennessee. I have mixed feelings about the TTB proposal to eliminate standard bottle sizes in favor of minimum and maximum sizes. On the one hand, I look forward to greater selection if 700 ml bottles are allowed to be imported. The flip side, however, is that foreign distillers and bottlers might choose to standardize on the 700 ml size for all markets. A distillery could then introduce new expressions into the U.S. in 700 ml bottles and switch over the entire product line once consumers become used to seeing 700 ml bottles from that distillery. Of course, we all know that prices per bottle in the U.S. won't be reduced if this occurs. Carlton, I really can't argue with that. It's a very real possibility that prices might not change, and given the way whiskey prices have been rising, we might well wind up paying more either way. We had several listeners sending along links to a TMZ story following Wednesday night's Stanley Cup Game 7 won by the St. Louis Blues. The story was on Blues player Robbie Fabry chugging from a $1,200 bottle of Pappy Van Winkle on the ice after the game. Well, let's get this straight. He was actually drinking the Van Winkle Family Reserve Rye, which technically is not a Pappy Van Winkle bottling. Pappy only appears on the 15, 20, and 23-year-old bourbons. And yeah, the secondary market price for that bottle probably was about $1,200, but the Van Winkle family's recommended retail price is $120 or so. Still, as a longtime hockey fan, win the Stanley Cup and you can drink your whiskey any way you like, even if it's overpriced and straight from the bottle. By the way, extra congratulations to Hockey Hall of Famer Larry Robinson. Not only was he honored in the last few weeks with the release of his NHL Alumni Series whiskey from J.P. Wiser's in Canada, but as an executive with the Blues, he's getting his name on the Stanley Cup for the 10th time. No word on whether he had a bottle of his own whiskey for the celebration. And finally, since it is Father's Day, we did a tongue-in-cheek poll on Twitter this weekend to find the perfect Father's Day gift for Dad. Whiskey came in first at 55%. Whiskey also came in tied for second and third at 16% each, while so-called whiskey crap, things like flasks and whiskey stones, stuff like that, got 13%. Who needs a tie anyway? If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, well, you can always get in touch with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. You can also email me directly. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other stuff that all make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Got an email this week from Luke Waddell in Colorado. Here's what he had to say. In one of the recent episodes, you discussed a distillery which was using aged IPA beer as the source, doing the distilling, then aging the result and selling the product as a whiskey. During a discussion with folks from 1205 Distillery in Indianapolis, Indiana, they did a similar run with a barrel-aged porter, but were not able to call the product a, quote, whiskey due to the hops required in the beer-making process. My understanding was that the hops did not count as grain, so the term whiskey was rejected in their label request. How is the requirement defined? It appears in this case a different reviewer within the government allowed one product to be labeled as whiskey, while the other was not. What are other examples like this? Well, the example that Luke is referring to is Charbet's whiskey, distilled from Bear Republic Brewing's Racer 5 IPA beer. And I wasn't able to find specific details for how 1205 Distillery tried to get its label approved, but when Charbet submits the labels for its whiskeys that are distilled from fully brewed beer to the TTB, they go into the flavored whiskey category and are described on the label as, quote, hop-flavored whiskey. I'm guessing that 1205 tried to get its whiskeys into a standard whiskey category, and the TTB rejected it for that reason. Luke, I hope that answers your question, and if you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, and a whole lot more, along with a complete archive of past episodes back to 2005. We'd love to hear from you this week. Get in touch with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Make this Father's Day unforgettable with a personalized bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. Go to reservebar.com and use code GIFTDAD for exclusive pricing on an engraved bottle. Because if anyone deserves Blue Label, it's Dad. Please drink responsibly. Johnnie Walker Blue Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo, Norwalk, Connecticut.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.